Okay, hello everybody. This is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit, and we are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevukhim. We are on section 2, chapter 42, which in the Shlomo Pine's edition of the guide is on page 388. We are in the middle of a lengthy discussion about prophecy, the prophetic experience. And last week we talked a little bit about some of the terminology that you might find in the Torah. One of the things that the Rambam asserts most strongly is that anytime a person has a prophecy, it is via an intermediary that he calls an angel. And anytime a person has a prophecy, it is through a vision. The only exception is, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. But any other time you find in Tanakh that God speaks to an individual, it's really God speaking in a vision to the individual, meaning that it's the person is in a dreamlike state, something deeper than a dream. And there is some kind of intermediary force that implants the voice or the idea and a vision within the prophet's mind. It's not coming directly from God. The Rambam, of course, is maintaining a very Aristotelian view of God, who is completely transcendent and removed from our plane of existence, and therefore the connection between the divine and the human must be via intermediary because the chasm is too wide, the gap is too wide between the two. I want to share with you my screen because there's a lot to talk about for today's chapter. This is actually what I would consider to be an important chapter. And as I say every week, if you are not watching this via video, but you're listening to it on a podcast, you can always download the handout. It's on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and it's also on webyeshiva.org's course description of this course, Moreh Nevukhim. There was a book written in 1935 by a scholar named Joseph Sarachek, who was at JTS, The Conflict Over the Rationalism of Maimonides, where he details the four major conflicts that arose both during and after the lifetime of the Rambam, where people who had a more traditional view of many of the issues of theology that the Rambam discusses really took issue, very strong issue with the Rambam, viewing the Rambam's writings, especially the writings in the guide, as a great threat to the long-standing traditions. In this book, Sarachek lists 25 distinct charges of the traditionalists against the Rambam's writings. I'll just show you what 15 and 16 are as they pertain to our chapter today. Because our chapter, I've titled it, Any Biblical Narrative of Angels is Purely Visionary. According to the Rambam, and we've seen the Rambam say this before, especially in chapter 34 and in subsequent chapters. He's also said it in chapter 6, going all the way back to chapter 6 of this section, that any time a prophet has a vision or a human being is depicted in the Torah or in Tanakh as having a vision of an angel, it's not that the angel is ontologically there in the physical world. Angels are completely disembodied, and therefore you can only have a vision of an angel in your mind as an illustration that is created in your imagination faculty of an angel. But angels do not occupy a physical space and certainly cannot be seen in a physical plane. And so the 15 and 16 are that Maimonides denied that angels were corporeal beings, regarding them as identical with the intelligences of Aristotle. We talked about the intelligences that Aristotle depicts as being connected to the celestial bodies and as well of other things as well. This view was a severe blow to the prevalent angelology in mystical and traditional circles. Okay, that's point number one. 16, and this is most relevant to our chapter today, he taught that all scriptural stories in which angels appear or speak are dreams or visions. Hence, the stories of the angels connected with Avraham, with Yaakov, and with Bil'am were not actual occurrences. Even though, when you look at the biblical narrative, it seems quite clear that when Avraham had a vision of three men who later he discovered were angels, were walking towards him on that hot day in the noon sun, and he's just had his circumcision, and he's looking to be able to do a mitzvah, and he sees three people, and he runs towards them, and he greets them, and brings them into his home, and he washes their feet, and he feeds them, and gives them a meal, and he speaks to his wife Sarah, and tells her to do certain things. And all of the things that are depicted in that narrative never took place on a physical plane. They never actually occurred. If you would have had a video camera recording those events of Avraham on that day, you would see Avraham in a comatose state, having just being in a sleep-like trance, and there were no angels that came to visit Avraham, according to Maimonides. Yaakov's wrestling match with the angel, which we're going to talk about shortly, also did not occur on a physical plane. That was a prophetic image. And finally, Bilam, the story of Bilam, his talking donkey, and the angel that appeared to him in the road were not actual occurrences. In the minds of many, this view affects the authenticity of biblical history. I mean, I think that's sort of an understatement, right? And the truth of the matter is that there were grounds historically for traditionalists to be quite concerned with these views that we're going to see in this chapter, because historically there were movements in the Middle Ages of people who were, I guess, what you would call neo-Maimonideans, who actually took the ideas of the Rambam a little bit further than what the Rambam himself advocated for. There were people who believed that all of the stories in the book of Genesis were really just metaphors and analogies. There was no Avraham, there was no Yitzchak, there was no Yaakov. And of course, the Rambam never says that. But, you know, if you take an idea like this that you find in our chapter and you extrapolate and develop it and go beyond the parameters of this idea, it could be potentially very dangerous. So the Rambam's first statement, as from the Pines edition reads, we're just condensing it a little bit as the opening statement. We have explained in chapter 41 that wherever it is mentioned that an angel was seen or had spoken, this has happened only in a vision of prophecy or in a dream, whether this is explicitly stated or not. And we'll refer you back to chapter 41, where the Rambam had said that there are 4 different kinds of ways that the Torah can communicate that. But ultimately, every time that the Torah tells us that God spoke to a person, it's via an angel, an intermediary force, and in a dream state. In a vision or dream, the prophet sometimes sees God speaking to him, as will be explained in chapters 44 and 45. Sometimes he sees an angel speaking to him, and sometimes he hears someone speaking to him without seeing the individual who is speaking. And sometimes he sees a human individual who speaks to him, and afterwards it becomes clear to him that it was really not a human being, but it was an angel. So with that intro, let's just look at the structure of our chapter. The Rambam focuses on primarily 3 biblical narratives, that of Avraham and his 3 guests, that from Genesis chapter 18, that of Jacob and his wrestling match with the angel, and that's from Genesis chapter 32. And finally, the story of Bilam and his talking donkey who meet the angel on the road on his way to curse the Jewish people. And that, of course, is from the book of Numbers, chapter 22. So using that structure, and then we'll look a little bit at the end of the chapter where the Rambam sort of ties things together with some other additional ideas. Let's first talk about the Rambam's contention with Avram's visit from the 3 angels. The fact that this was purely visionary hinges on the following verse. I have the first 3 verses of Parshat Vayera listed here before you, that God appeared, Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei Mamre. God appeared before Avraham in the plains of Mamre. He is sitting there on the hot day sun. Now the Torah then says he lifts up his eyes and he sees 3 men. According to the Rambam, and this is really a crucial point, if God is appearing to Avraham in Pasuk Aleph, in the first verse, then when it says that he lifted up his eyes, he's in the middle of a visionary prophetic experience with God. So his lifting up of his eyes, according to the Rambam, is in the midst of his prophetic dream. In his vision, he sees himself lifting up his eyes and seeing 3 men. He sees Vayoratz likratami petach ha'ohel, and he runs to greet them from the opening of the tent, and he bows down. Vayomar, and then he says, Adonai, my master, imna matzati chen be'einecha, if I have found favor in your eyes, al na ta'avor me al avdecha, do not pass away from your servant, do not pass aside from your servant, please stay here. Now, the key word here in this verse is the word ta'avor. What's curious about that word, for those of you who are grammarians, if there are three men approaching him and he's speaking to the three men, Avraham really should have said, Al na ta'avru, in the plural. Please, my masters, do not pass, all three of you collectively, do not pass aside. Please come into my home. So why does it say you in the singular and not you in the plural? Rashi, on the Chumash, gives us two interpretations, both of which are found in the Midrash. The first opinion that he gives is the opinion that the Rambam latches onto, and this is the opinion of what he says is the great Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia in the Medrash says, La Godol Shebahem Amar. We're just going to learn the Rashi. How do you explain that Avraham was speaking in the singular when there are three people in front of him? The answer is he spoke to the most prominent of the three men, which the Midrash identifies as the angel Michael, the angel Michael. Ukra'am kulam adonim v'lagadol amar al nata avor. So he says the word Adonai, which means my masters in the plural, but then he addresses the lead guy, the front man, and he says, please, you individual, sir, do not pass away from where I am. The kaven shelo ya'avorhu ya'amdu chaverav imo. Once the lead person agrees to accept Avraham's invitation, the other two will follow as well. Uvelashon zehu chol. And using this interpretation, the word Adonai means my masters with a lowercase m. It's not at all a reference to God. Davar acher. And then Rashi gives us the second interpretation that we're probably perhaps a little bit more familiar with. Kadoshu, or Kodeshu. The name Adonai is a reference to God himself. V'haya omer lahakadosh baruch hu lahamtin lo ad sheyarutz v'yachnis et ha'orchim. And what Avraham was basically doing is that he was having this prophetic experience, as is evidenced by the first verse, that God appears to him in the plains of Mamre. All of a sudden, while he's having this prophetic experience, his sensory vision of the outside world is still active on some level, and he sees three men in a distance as he's being visited in a visionary prophecy by God. And he turns to God in the midst of his prophecy, and he says, God, and that's the word Adonai in verse 3, please do me a favor, wait for me, do not leave me, so that I can go ahead and greet my guests. And therefore, in Rashi's second interpretation, when the verse says, you in the singular, please, you, God, do not pass away or pass aside from our conversation, just please wait for me. The Rambam rejects that opinion. The Rambam believes that once God is appearing to Avraham, consistent with his whole shita, with his whole opinion on what the prophetic experience is, that you enter into a trance, Avraham had no external perception of what was going on in the world around him. And therefore, when we talk, he's in the midst of this prophecy while he's seeing all of this going on, and he's speaking in his prophecy to one of those guests. Now, the Abarbanel asks, where do you see from the verses themselves that Avraham is still in the midst of a prophecy when he's speaking to his guests? The Abarbanel suggests that if indeed Avraham was in the midst of a prophecy with God, and if indeed he's speaking, as Rabbi Chia says, to one of the angels, where then would we ever see that Avraham detaches himself from the prophecy? If there's no mention of Avraham detaching himself from the prophecy, which is the way Rashi learns in the second opinion, but instead Avraham is speaking to the angels. He's saying Adonai in the plural, my masters, and he says to the angel Michael, the leader, please come and accept my invitation to join me in my home. then where do we ever see that Avraham in any way took his leave from God? He didn't, according to this opinion. And therefore, we must conclude that there is still a visionary experience, a prophetic experience going on while all of this is happening. And that, says the Barbanel, and I have it here for you in not such clear font because it's from one of the earlier editions, but that's where we see that, according to the Rambam, that this whole narrative is taking place in a vision. Okay? And the Rambam writes this cryptic statement: understand this story too, for it is one of the secrets, or in Hebrew, sod min hasodot. It is one of the very important secrets of the Torah, that so many of the narratives where an individual is conversing with an angel is happening in a visionary experience. Now, back when we studied chapter 34, I shared with you a portion of Nachmanides' commentary to the beginning of Genesis chapter 18. I didn't give you this paragraph, which is earlier in the commentary. He quotes the Rambam in our chapter 42. This is the Ramban's Perush, his commentary to the Chumash, to the Torah, on Genesis chapter 18, verse 1. After he quotes the Rambam, and basically he argues, how could it be that Avraham was in the midst of serving guests on the physical plane if he's in the middle of a visionary experience? Because after all, the Torah starts in the chapter by saying, Vayera elav Hashem, that God appeared to Avraham. And if he's in the midst of this visionary experience, this prophetic experience, how could he just interrupt? That's the way the Rambam understands it. Vihine lidvarav, and I just want to cut to the chase. The Ramban's main question is that according to what the Rambam is writing, lo lasha Sarah ugot, we have a serious problem, because remember, what does Avraham do in the story? Not only does he bring his guests in the tent, but he also instructs Sarah, lushi va'asi ugot, you go ahead, Sarah, make dough and prepare it into bread. Velo asa Avraham ben Bakar. And Avraham also is depicted in the verses as having slaughtered one of the livestock and preparing it for his guests, a calf. It didn't happen. It's all happening in a prophecy, in a vision in his mind. V'gam lo tzachaka Sarah. And when the Torah says, Vatitzchak Sarah, that Sarah laughed, that never happened. That Sarah is part of Avraham's prophetic dream. Rak hakol mar'ah. Everything was in a vision. V'imkein baha chalom hazeh berov inyan kachalomot hasheker. And the Ramban's words are very dramatic here. He says, if so, then all of this vision is like a false dream. It's a fake dream. Avraham is having images of things that never happened and never would happen. And so it seems like this is a false prophecy. Kimat to'elet leharot lo kol zeh. What benefit is there for Avram to have a vision of him preparing food for guests that are not physically in front of him? What is the benefit of the calf that is being slaughtered? What is the benefit of him conversing to Sarah in a dream and telling her to bake bread? What is the benefit of depicting Sarah as laughing when she never laughed at the prospect of her becoming pregnant and having a child? These are very, very powerful questions. And once again, when we look at the Abarbanel's commentary to this chapter in Moreh Nevukhim, we see that he addresses this issue quite extensively. And the Abarbanel's mahalach is as follows. His approach is that in reality, there is pertinence to this dream, in that what God was showing Avraham is that not only was he going to have a child, but that the reason that God had chosen Avraham as the progenitor of the Jewish people is because of his personal conduct and the way that he took care of people. It is because you, Avraham, care for absolute strangers, and you feed them, and you bring them into your home, and you and your wife Sarah do all that you normally do to take care of your guests. That is the reason why I have chosen you to have a child whose name will be Yitzchak, and that is the reason why your seed shall be the chosen people. And that's the purpose of the prophecy. And the truth of the matter is that even though Sarah never laughed upon hearing the words of the angels, because this is all in part of a dream, God had nonetheless needed to reveal to Avraham that there is only one small defect in both you and your wife Sarah, is that you lack the faith to believe that what I'm promising to you is going to come true. And both you and Sarah need to sort of up your game, so to speak, and realize that all of this is really going to come true and eliminate all of those doubts that you currently harbor in your hearts. That was the function of the vision. That was the function of this entire narrative unfolding according to the Abarbanel in a visionary experience. So I want you to sort of store that in your data banks. That's the Rambam's opinion about Avraham and his three guests. It happens all in a vision. And if you're wondering about the Ramban's question, this all looks like it's a false vision because it never happened, and why all the details of that vision, the Abarbanel addresses that issue. Let's go on to the next story. Yaakov's wrestling match with the angel. We know that the story tells us at the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach, Yaakov is preparing to go back to the land of Canaan to see his parents. He knows he's going to have an encounter with Esav, and he offers a prayer up to God, and he prepares to go to battle with Esav. He also sends a gift to Esav in advance. And then the Torah says that after he takes all of his family, Vayikachem, he takes his whole family as they progress into the land of Israel. Vayavirem et hanachal, and they pass over a brook. Vayaver et asher lo, and he brings all of his possessions and passes them over this small creek or river, whatever it was. And then the Torah says, Vayivater Yaakov levado, Yaakov remains alone, Vaye avek ish imo ad alot hashachar, and a man wrestled with him until the morn. Now we have no indication that this is taking place in a dreamlike state. But the Rambam points out this is an example of a visionary experience where Yaakov thinks that it's a man, and that's why the Torah depicts him as an ish, but later realizes that it's an angel. And just as with Avraham, where he was in the middle of a prophetic vision and saw the angels in his vision, the same is true with Yaakov. Where, however, is Yaakov depicted as having a vision? This is really a huge chidush, what the Rambam is about to tell us. If you look at the last verses of the previous Torah portion, Parshat Vayetze, the Torah says that after Yaakov's encounter of leaving of Lavan's house and being pursued by Lavan, and having that encounter with Lavan, and eventually, instead of going to war, they make a peace treaty with each other. And they shake hands on it, so to speak, and Lavan goes on his way, and Yaakov departs for Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. The Torah then says, Vayoshav Lavan limkamo, Lavan goes back to his place. Verse 2 of chapter 32, V'Yaakov halach lidarko, vayifgu uvo malachei Elokim, that Yaakov goes on his way, and he is met by angels of God. He is met by angels of God. That's a visionary experience. Vayomer Yaakov ka'asher ra'am machane Elokim zeh. Yaakov, in his dream, pronounces, this is a camp of angels, because the word Elohim over here means angels. Vayikra shem hamakom hahu machanayim. And he calls the name of the place the camp, based on the fact that he sees this cluster of angels greeting him. And as Rashi tells us, these are the angels of Eretz Yisrael coming out to greet Yaakov as he is coming back into the land of Israel. Now, the next verses, the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach, are now taking place in the real world, not in the visionary world. So the Rambam has to maneuver this. He's really got to finesse this carefully. Although Scripture interrupts this passage at the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach with the discussion of Yaakov's physical preparation in the real world to meet Esav, that physical preparation was all done before Yaakov has the vision of the angels. In other words, the Rambam has to rely on the principle of Ein Mukdam U'Meuchar Batorah. Sometimes the Torah speaks a little bit out of chronological order, and therefore this encounter, this visionary experience of the angels, actually happened after the Torah's depiction of Yaakov preparing to meet his brother Esav by sending him gifts and sending messengers to him and praying to God and so forth and so on. And so the angel that Yaakov wrestles with is one of the angels that he had encountered in Machanayim, in this place as he's crossing the border into Eretz Yisrael. And perhaps the Rambam would understand that Ma'avar Yabok is maybe the border, whether it's a tributary of the Jordan River, it's unclear. But whatever that body of water is, it is Yaakov's transition and meeting those angels, going from Chutz La'aretz into the land of Israel, and now he has this wrestling match. That's how the Rambam understands the story, purely a visionary experience. And the third episode that the Rambam chooses to focus upon is Bilam's conversation with the donkey and his meeting of the angel on the road. Many of us are already familiar with that story, but I just want to point out that the word of Vayavo is used in reference to Bilam, that God appears to Bilam Lila in the middle of the night. If you remember from the end of chapter 41, the Rambam had given us two examples of where the Torah says that God comes to a person in a vision of the night or in the night. The two examples that the Rambam had given to us were two unsavory characters, Lavan and Avimelech, the king of the Philistines. And here too, we have an unsavory character, the prophet, the idolatrous prophet Bilam. And here too, the Torah says that God came to Bilam in a vision of the night. And the Rambam understands that that visionary experience is continuing throughout the remainder of chapter 22 in the book of Numbers. In other words, that God is appearing to Bilam in a vision. And so therefore, when it says that Bilam arose in the morning and saddled his she-donkey, that's also part of the vision. And all of this travel, this whole journey that Bilam is having, he's having it epistemologically in his mind. It never took place on a plane of the physical reality in the outside world. But this whole story of him getting on his donkey, riding down the road, his donkey seeing the angel of God, and Bilam cannot yet see it, striking his donkey, the donkey pushing him against the wall, striking the donkey again, and finally the donkey opening up its mouth and speaking, is all part of a vision. It never took place because donkeys don't speak in the real world. Remember, Maimonides is also a miracle minimalist, as we've pointed out a number of times before. And therefore, the vision that he has finally, where if you remember in the verse, it says in verse 31 in chapter 22 of Numbers, Vayigal Hashem et einei Bilam, that finally God opens up or exposes Bilam's eyes. Vayaret malach Hashem nitzav b'derech, and he sees the angel of God standing on the road. V'charbo shalufa biyado, and its sword is in its hand. Vayikod vayishtachu le'apav, and he bows down to the angel, all in a vision. Okay, now this is problematic in and of itself. We've talked about the problems about Avraham. We've talked about the problems of Yaakov and the wrestling match, because you have to take the verses out of order. Let's talk a little bit about the problem with the way the Rambam depicts this visionary experience with Bilam. The fact of the matter is that the issue of the talking donkey is something that the Rambam cannot necessarily repackage and reinterpret. First of all, we know that the Rambam himself says that the donkey's miraculous speech was an actual physical miracle. Where do we know this from? The fact of the matter is that it says in Pirkei Avot, in chapter 5, that there were 10 things that God created at the very, very end of the sixth day of creation, as the Sabbath was coming in. What the Mishnah says is Bein Hashmashot. And one of those things is the mouth of the donkey. It's together with the hole in the ground that would eventually open up and swallow up Korach and his men, and many other things, miraculous phenomena. God put those things into motion at the beginning of creation. We've talked about how the Rambam understands that. But in the Rambam's commentary, he says that it was actually the mouth of the donkey. In other words, the future donkey that would actually manifest itself in the physical world. God put that miracle into motion, that it would take place hundreds of years after creation in the times of Bilam to be able to teach Bilam a lesson. So it seems that the Rambam is contradicting himself. It also appears as if the Rambam seems to say the same thing in a previous chapter of the guide. And now this is something that is challenged by a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Shmuel ben Avraham of Soporta. And Soporta, I'm not sure exactly where that is, but this rabbi wrote a letter to defend the Rambam's position, the rationalist school position, against all of the Rambam's detractors. He lived sometime between the 13th century and the 15th century. We don't really have that much information, but there is a sefer called Ginzei Nistarot, which was published in the 19th century by a maskil, one of the Enlightenment scholars, and he published a whole bunch of different items in the Sefer Ginzei Nistarot, and this letter is one of those things that is published in that work. And he writes, "V'chein petichat." I'm just have a snippet of it here for you. "V'chein petichat pi ha'aton lo yadanu mala u'lechlal divrei Bilam v'ha'aton asher amar shayu b'mar'eh nevuah." He says, so Rabbi Shmuel ben Avraham of Saporta says, I don't know how to explain how the Rambam could say that the whole story of the talking donkey was in a vision. Ki kavar omar b'sefer hazeh shahayata kimishma'a. He says the Rambam has already said in this work. If you go back to Shaharei Nimsabo Beferush Ki Hayata La'aton Bilam Ayidei Koach Shenatan Behatenuah. Go back to chapter 6, where the Rambam discusses the motion of the donkey. I want to point out that when we learned that originally, there was some discrepancy between the commentaries. One commentary said that the motion of the donkey is not the donkey's mouth, and others say that Kreskis says that it was the mouth of the donkey. So according to Kreskis and those commentaries who understand that the Rambam is talking about the talking donkey in Moreh Nevukhim itself, the Rambam himself is contradicting himself, and perhaps that's the reason why the other commentaries say it's not the movement of the donkey's mouth, but the movement of the donkey's body. And he says, "Ve'im haya b'daito shepi ha'aton haya b'mar'eh ha'nevuah lo hayata sham klal tenuah nimtzeit." He says, how can you tell me that the donkey's mouth moved if this is all happening in a vision? V'chein b'perushei hamishnayot b'masechet avot katav Rabbeinu Hagadol Zal. Our master, the Rambam, in his commentary to the Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot, said, "Asara devarim shenivru ben hashmashot pi haaretz u'pi habe'er u'pi ha'aton." Right, all of the miraculous phenomena, including the mouth of the donkey. Upirsham kulam kipshatam ve'amar beferush ula'aton shetidaber. The Rambam, in his commentary, understands that these things did manifest in the physical world. And so he leaves with a tzarich iyun. He leaves with this is a question. We must therefore conclude that, in his opinion, this Rav Shmuel Misaporta, he says that when the Rambam says that this all happened in a vision, he's not including the donkey. The donkey actually spoke, but everything around the donkey, meaning, in other words, Bilam actually rode on a donkey. He heard the donkey speaking, but the vision that he had of the angel was in his mind, and everything else happened on a physical plane. So there you have a little bit, this is really a tzarich iyun, because the Rambam does not seem to be saying what Rabbi Shmuel of Saporta suggests that he is saying, but just understand that this is a bit of a problem. The Rambam concludes this chapter with discussing other prophecies and non-prophetic visions. He gives an example of where people have prophecies or near prophecies of angels, and all of those are not happening in the outside world. Ontologically, they're happening epistemologically in the mind. So you have the story about Joshua, where in chapter 5 of Joshua, it says that he has a vision, Vayisayina Vayar, he lifts up his eyes and he sees that there's a man standing in front of him. And here too, Joshua initially mistakes this person as a warrior with a sword in his hand. And only afterwards does he realize that it's an angel. And after Joshua's death, at the beginning of the book of Judges, it says, Vayal malach Hashem min ha-Gilgal el habochim, that an angel of God came from Gilgal and revealed himself to the entire Jewish people. And it says, Vayihi, and in verse 4, it says, Vayihi kitaber malach Hashem et ha-devarim ha'ela. The angel sort of castigates the people and says, you have not followed the ways of your ancestors. And when he tells them these words, to El Kol B'nai Yisrael, to the entire Jewish people, Vayisu ha'amet kolam vayivku, then everyone lifted up their voices and they cried. Now this presents a double problem. Number one, according to the Rambam, this could not have happened on a physical plane because you don't see an angel in the real world. And number two, how could everyone have this mass prophecy? We never find a mass prophecy other than the event at Sinai. So how is an angel revealing himself to an entire population of Jews who have not prepared themselves properly for the prophetic experience? And so therefore, this could not have been an angel since it was manifest to all of Israel. And therefore, the Rambam quotes the Medrash in Vayikra Rabbah, who says that it was none other than Pinchas, the great zealot who helped the Jewish people and who actually was one of the leaders for them. And he was the one who had the prophecy after Joshua's death, gave Musar, gave strong admonishments to the people for the fact that they were straying from God. And it was his message that is known as the angel of God, because we have already explained, going back to chapter 6 of this section, that a prophet is sometimes called an angel. And I refer you back to chapter 34, where we reviewed that idea as well, where there are many different words, many different things that the word malach refers to, because the word malach simply means an intermediary force. And many times the prophet himself, who is an intermediary of God, who brings God's message to the world, himself is called an angel. Other sources that indicate that a prophet is called an angel, he brings from the book of Chagai. Vayomer Chagai malach Hashem, that Chagai, the prophet, is known as the angel of God. And during the reign of Tzidkiyahu, in the book of Chronicles, it says, Vayihiyu mal'ivim b'malachei ha'elokim, that the people ridiculed the angels of God who were sent to them. And of course, there it's not talking about real angels that are being ridiculed. It says that God sent in the hands of his angels a message to the people, because God had compassion and wanted to get the people to rehabilitate themselves. Instead, the people ridiculed those angels. It doesn't mean literally angels, it means the prophets of God. Daniel's vision of Gabriel, then, says the Rambam, also took place in a prophecy, even though the implication of the verse is that it happened in the real world. But it says, as Daniel says in chapter 9, as I'm in the midst of prayer, Veha'ish Gavriel, the angel Gabriel that I saw in a vision, Mu'af bi'af nogea Eli, was flying and then touching me, ke'et minchat arev, as it was getting towards evening. This is all part of the visionary experience. And the visionary experience of angels is consistent with the verse in the book of Bamidbar, which says that when God spoke to Aaron and Miriam, like we learned about God criticizing Aaron and Miriam for not understanding the nature of Moses' prophecy, we talked a little bit about that more last week, that God had said, Vayomer Shimuna Devarai, Im Nevukhim Hashem Bamar'a Elavet Vada, that God says, I appear to normal prophets in a mar'ah. And if you remember, the interpretation of the Malbim was that the word mar'ah is an unclear lens, or a mirror is the way the Malbim had explained it, meaning that it's an indirect vision of God. Indirect means via intermediary. So this is all consistent, the Rambam says, with my thesis that every prophecy is via an angel. And finally, the Rambam concludes the chapter with visions of non-prophets. And the Rambam says that there are people who are not unsavory people, but they're also not ready to be prophets. They're righteous people, people like Hagar, Manoach's wife, who were the parents of the great leader Shimshon. The story of Hagar, there are two places in the Torah where she is visited by an angel. And of course, in the book of Judges, chapter 13, Manoach and his wife are visited by an angel who tell him who tell them that they will have a child who shall be a Nazarite. And the Rambam simply says the words they heard for that occurred to their mind. The words that they heard occurred to their mind, that they heard occurred to their mind were similar to the bat kol, which the sages constantly mention. In other words, it's a near prophetic experience. God is sending them a message that he implants in their minds, but it's not a clear vision like a prophetic vision. And this can be demonstrated by the usage of the word vayimtsa'a, that it says in the case of Hagar, vayimtsa'a malach Hashem al ein hamayim, that God finds her at a well, at an oasis in the desert, al ha'ayin b'derech shor, at the oasis, right? So the fact that God finds her means that she is not ready to receive a prophetic experience. It's that God has to pursue her in order to implant a vision in her mind. A prophet has been primed and is prepared to receive the message of God. But when you say that I find you, it means I happen across you because you're not ready for the prophecy. And that's the explanation. And the Rambam then compares that to another time where it says that a person was found by a person. Vayimtsaehu ish, that a man encountered Yosef as he was sent by his father Yaakov to find his brethren. V'hinei to'eh basadeh, and Yosef was wandering in the desert. Vayishalehu ha'ish le'mor ma tivakesh, and this man, who it is later clear that it is an angel according to our tradition, is the person who communicates with Yosef. And as the commentaries point out, the reason why the Rambam invokes the story of Yosef is to demonstrate that Hagar herself was not a prophetess. Yosef, we know, was only a 17-year-old youth. He was immature, and he was not ready to receive prophecy. And contextually from the story, it seems that Yosef had a lot to develop and grow at that stage in his life. If that's the word vayimtsaehu that is found in the context of Yosef, then similarly when it says vayimtsa'a in the context of Hagar, it also means that she was not in the state where she was yet ready for prophecy. And yet God can communicate with those people as well. But even when God is communicating to a non-prophet, by sending them a vision of an angel in their mind, it is a visionary experience. There is no actual physical angel. And even though that may sound problematic, because if I'm not a prophet, then how can I have a vision in my mind? It's an unclear vision. It's like the bat kol that the rabbis talk about, that they heard a heavenly voice. You get a sense that there's something there in your mind, but it's like a mirage. You can tell that it's fuzzy, it's not clear, it's blurry, and yet you still get the message that there is someone communicating with you. Just to conclude this chapter, because I know we've gone over time, the question that you may ask yourselves is, and this may be a little bit outside of the text of the Rambam, why is it that Hagar and Yosef are connected at the end of our chapter? Why, obviously, the Rambam is connecting them to demonstrate from the story of Yosef that Hagar was a non-prophet. But you might also ask yourself the question, why is it that the Torah connects the two of them together by using the very same verb to describe a visionary experience of an angel? I saw a beautiful idea brought down in a Hasidic sefer. Maybe the Rambam meant it, maybe he didn't mean it, but I just thought I would end the chapter this way, is that when God finds you, it's because you're running away from something. And when I find something that's running away, it's because I've been pursuing it. And that's what it means to be motzei something. Like if you are searching for a lost object, you finally look around wherever you can find it until you find it because it's lost. In both of those cases, Hagar and Yosef, in a sense, were lost. They had been disenfranchised and estranged from their normal home, and they felt somewhat lost because they felt disconnected from their loved ones. And that's the connection between the two. A lot of times God will find those people, and that's a beautiful way to end the chapter. If anyone ever feels lost, God will find you eventually and send you that image. But in any event, I wanted to close out the chapter this way. The bottom line is that the Rambam makes some very, very bold claims in this chapter that anytime you see a narrative in the Bible of an angel, it's all in a vision, and therefore there's some really unusual interpretations that the Rambam has to go towards in order to be able to make all of this fit in that in it within his position. And of course, as we understand, because angels are incorporeal, like Aristotle's intelligences, they cannot be actual physical beings. And because angels must always act as that intermediary between man and God, that vision is going to happen in the mind of the prophet. I hope that's clear. I know that there were some people that were asking questions. Let me just take a quick look if there are any. They say that a dream is 1/60th of prophecy. That's right. Okay. How can that angel be a mass vision? It's not a mass vision, right, as we said. What about the angel in Shemot that is sent before the Israelites in the desert? Ah, I see your question. Right, so the Rambam actually talked a little bit about that. That's an angel that is not visible, but it's really just an intermediary force. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful day. And I just want to let you all know that I will be traveling next week. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. So no class next week. We will see you in 2 weeks' time for chapter 43. Thank you.
Thank you.